The excavator's bucket stopped less than a foot from my grandfather's dam before I finally opened my mouth. The smell of wet earth, diesel exhaust, and fresh cedar filled the cool Texas morning while the river flowed quietly beneath the old concrete spillway. Linda Harper stood beside the construction foreman with a leather folder tucked under one arm, wearing the kind of confident smile people wear when they believe the fight is already over. She tapped the paperwork against her palm and looked directly at me. "For $100, she said. "That is all this would have cost you. Pay the fee, sign the compliance agreement, and we can finally remove this eyesore." Behind her, the excavator idled patiently. The operator rested one hand on the controls, waiting for a signal. The crew avoided eye contact. Nobody wanted to be the first person to touch a structure that had clearly been standing there for decades. I looked past them at the water sliding across the spillway exactly the way it had every morning for as long as I could remember. Linda thought we were arguing over an unpaid Homeowners Association fee. She thought this was another routine neighborhood dispute that would end with a signature and a demolition crew. She had no idea she was standing in front of the only thing holding back an entire river system that engineers had quietly depended on for more than half a century. "You are really risking everything over $400? She asked again, almost laughing. I smiled back. "No," I said. "You are." The confused look on her face lasted only a second before she dismissed it with a shrug. She believed the money was the argument. It never was. "My name is Ethan Walker. I am 39 years old, a civil engineer by profession and the third-generation caretaker of 112 acres of Texas land that has belonged to my family for longer than anyone in Willow Creek Estates has been alive. My grandfather used to tell me that a river never forgets who respects it. I never truly understood what he meant until I watched strangers park an excavator beside the dam he had built with his own hands. Our property sat just outside of growing Texas, town where live oak trees leaned over limestone banks and the smell of cedar drifted across the water every spring. My grandfather started stacking those limestone blocks in 1968 with county approval and guidance from local engineers because every heavy rain used to flood ranches downstream. It took him almost 2 years to finish. He never called it a dam. He always smiled and called it an old neighbor that worked 24 hours a day. My father inherited the land after him and spent every weekend maintaining the spillway, clearing driftwood, inspecting concrete joints, and recording water levels inside a weathered notebook that still sits on my kitchen shelf today. When my father passed away, I promised myself I would never let that place fall apart. Every Saturday morning started the same way. Fresh coffee in a metal mug, damp grass soaking through my boots, the quiet hum of insects before sunrise. I would walk the crest of the structure listening to water slide across the overflow exactly the way my grandfather designed it decades earlier. To most people, it looked like nothing more than a peaceful pond surrounded by trees. Families driving past slowed down to admire the reflection on calm mornings, never realizing that every inch of that peaceful water existed because generations before them understood exactly how rivers behave. Then Willow Creek Estates arrived. What had once been cattle pasture slowly turned into rows of expensive homes with matching mailboxes, decorative stone entrances, and perfectly trimmed lawns. Every few months another section appeared, replacing open fields with concrete streets and luxury houses. Along with those houses came the Homeowners Association, led by Linda Harper. She drove a spotless white sport utility vehicle, wore expensive sunglasses no matter the weather, and carried herself like every fence, mailbox, and tree in the neighborhood answered directly to her. At first our interactions stayed polite. She waved during community events and complimented the view across the water. Then the letters started arriving. First it was a complaint about an old maintenance shed sitting entirely on my property. Then it was equipment parked beside the spillway. Then came notices claiming my dam reduced the visual appeal of future waterfront development. Every envelope said the same thing. Comply now or face the consequences. I kept every letter inside a filing cabinet because engineers trust records more than opinions, and my grandfather had always said that paper outlives loud voices. I had no interest in fighting anyone. I simply wanted to protect the land the same way my family always had. Looking back now, I realized the river had already started warning us long before anyone bothered to listen. The first face behind every certified letter was always Linda Harper. She never raised her voice because she did not have to. Her confidence came wrapped in polished smiles, expensive stationery, and the assumption that nobody would ever challenge her. The first time she visited my property, she stepped out of her spotless white sport utility vehicle wearing perfectly pressed clothes that somehow looked untouched by the Texas dust. She stepped out of her spotless white sport utility vehicle and slowly looked across the lake the way a developer looks at empty land before signing a contract. Her smile was polished, but there was nothing friendly behind it. "This could become the centerpiece of Willow Creek Estates," she said. "Walking trails, decorative lighting, kayak rentals, picnic areas. Property values would go through the roof." She spoke as though my family had simply been watching over the land until the Homeowners Association arrived to put it to better use. Then she looked directly at me and added, "You really should think about the community instead of clinging to the past." I politely reminded her that every inch of the shoreline belonged to my property and that the dam was private infrastructure maintained at my expense. Her smile never disappeared, but something colder settled behind her eyes. From that day forward, every conversation became another negotiation I had never asked for. The Homeowners Association board started referring to my land during public meetings as an underutilized community asset. Neighbors who had once waved from their driveways began asking whether I planned to donate lake access because they had heard it would benefit everyone. I realized very quickly that stories spread much faster than facts. Linda knew exactly how to shape the conversation. She never claimed ownership directly. Instead, she repeated phrases like community improvement, shared responsibility, and neighborhood beautification until people forgot where private property ended and wishful thinking began. Then the letters became more aggressive. One claimed that the spillway created an unnecessary visual obstruction. Another suggested that the structure represented an outdated environmental practice despite decades of successful inspections. Then came the one that made me stop breathing for a moment. According to the Homeowners Association, I owed $400 in administrative compliance fees because I had failed to respond to multiple community enhancement requests. I read the letter 3 times while the afternoon breeze carried the scent of wet limestone across the water. $400 was never the problem. I could have written the check before finishing my morning coffee. The problem was what came after the payment. The moment I paid that fee as requested, I would be admitting that the Homeowners Association had authority over land they had never owned. Linda believed she was collecting $400. What she was really asking me to surrender was more than 50 years of property rights. I placed the notice beside every previous letter inside my filing cabinet and noticed how neatly the dates lined up, almost like someone had been following a schedule. Every document pushed a little farther than the last. Every demand tested another boundary. Engineers are trained to recognize patterns before failures happen. Standing there in my workshop surrounded by decades of survey maps and maintenance logs, I had the uneasy feeling that none of this was actually about a fee, a view, or a lake. Linda Harper was trying to establish something much bigger. If she could convince enough people that my dam existed only because the Homeowners Association allowed it, then eventually someone would forget the truth entirely. Outside, the steady sound of water continued flowing across the spillway exactly as it had for decades, patient, consistent, and completely unaware that a battle over paper and perception had quietly begun. The deadline arrived on a warm Thursday afternoon with the smell of fresh rain drifting through the open windows of my workshop. I was reviewing inspection records when another certified envelope landed inside my mailbox. By then I already recognized the weight of those letters before I even opened them. Inside was a formal notice from the Homeowners Association attorney. It claimed that my continued refusal to comply with community directives had created unnecessary legal expenses and administrative costs. The demand was simple: pay the $400 compliance fee, remove the dam within 30 days, and restore the creek to what they described as its natural condition. Reading those words felt like watching someone rewrite decades of history with a single paragraph. There was nothing natural about pretending the structure had never existed. My grandfather built it under county approval more than 50 years earlier. My father maintained it with documented inspections. I had continued the same routine every season since inheriting the property. Every maintenance record, engineering drawing, permit copy, and inspection report sat neatly organized inside steel filing cabinets only a few feet away. I called the attorney listed on the letter, hoping this had all been a misunderstanding. His voice remained calm and professional, but every answer sounded rehearsed. He explained that the Homeowners Association believed the structure no longer fit the neighborhood development plan. If I voluntarily removed the dam, they expected the dispute to disappear before it ever reached court. His voice stayed professional, but I could hear the hesitation underneath every sentence. He was repeating his client's position, not defending the engineering behind it. When I asked whether anyone had reviewed the original permits or county records, there was a long pause before he admitted he had only been provided documents by his client. That answer stayed with me long after. The call ended because it confirmed exactly what I had feared. Nobody representing the Homeowners Association had bothered to ask the engineers who originally approved the structure. They had started with a conclusion and were now looking for paperwork to support it. The following week, another meeting was scheduled at the community clubhouse. Linda Harper stood before the board with colorful presentation boards showing artist renderings of walking paths, landscape banks, decorative benches, and families enjoying what she called an improved riverfront experience. She never mentioned flood management. She never mentioned engineering reports. She never mentioned permits, inspections, or the decades of maintenance records sitting inside my filing cabinet. Instead, she reduced everything my family had built to a single phrase: an outdated obstacle. The room nodded along because nobody there knew the story behind that concrete wall. They only knew the version Linda wanted them to hear. Several homeowners applauded the proposal because it promised higher property values and a more attractive neighborhood entrance. Sitting quietly near the back of the room, I realized most of my neighbors were not bad people. They simply believed the only story they had been told. Linda had spent months repeating the same message until it sounded like fact. By then, almost everyone believed the dam was nothing more than an old inconvenience standing between them and a better-looking neighborhood. As the meeting ended, Linda walked past my chair and stopped just long enough to whisper, "You are still doing all this over $400. I looked up at her and answered quietly, "No, you just have not figured out what this place is really worth." She smiled one last time before walking away, completely convinced she had already won. After the meeting, I stopped Linda before she reached her vehicle. I opened my truck, pulled out the same binder that had followed my family for decades, and offered to show her every permit, every inspection, every survey, and every maintenance record connected to the dam. "If I am wrong," I said, "I will admit it today, but at least look at the documents before you order something destroyed." She smiled the way people do when they have already decided they are right. "Mr. Walker," she said, almost sounding amused, "old paperwork does not build modern communities. We are trying to improve this neighborhood, not preserve a museum." Then she folded her hands across the portfolio and added, "You are the only person standing in the way of progress." She spoke to me like I was a stubborn child refusing to accept the obvious, completely convinced that repeating the same argument would eventually make history disappear. The evening air felt strangely heavy as I drove back toward the property. Crickets filled the silence while the last light reflected across the calm surface behind the spillway. I stood on top of the old concrete wall listening to water flow with the same steady rhythm I had heard since childhood. For the first time, I wondered whether anyone besides my family truly understood why it had been built. The demand letter rested folded inside my jacket pocket, but I barely looked at it anymore. $400 had become Linda's favorite number. She repeated it so often that she actually believed it explained the entire dispute. It never did. The deadline kept moving closer, and despite every permit, inspection report, engineering drawing, and maintenance record sitting inside my filing cabinet, I could feel the pressure tightening one day at a time. For the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether facts alone would be enough to stop people who had already decided they did not need them. Somewhere beyond the trees, the river continued flowing exactly as it always had, completely unaware that a group of strangers believed they could erase more than 50 years of engineering with a single vote. The deadline kept moving closer, and despite every document I possessed, I could feel the pressure tightening one day at a time. For the next several weeks, I chose patience over confrontation because I honestly believed facts would eventually matter. Every morning, I drove to the county records office carrying another folder filled with surveys, permits, inspection reports, and maintenance logs that stretched back more than 5 decades. The clerks recognized me by name before long and always greeted me with sympathetic smiles as they helped locate another archived document. Every piece of paper confirmed the same simple truth. The structure had been legally built, legally maintained, and legally inspected for years. Yet every afternoon another certified letter arrived repeating the same demand. $400. Compliance. Dam removal. Every envelope sounded different, but every message meant exactly the same thing. Pay first. Admit their authority. Worry about the consequences later. The language stayed polite, almost friendly, but every sentence carried another quiet threat. Additional legal costs. Court proceedings. Property liens. None of it was really about collecting $400. It was about forcing me to acknowledge authority they had never legally possessed. My attorney remained optimistic, but he also reminded me that long legal disputes could become painfully expensive regardless of who was ultimately correct. That conversation stayed in my head while I walked the top of the spillway one cool evening listening to water slip across the concrete exactly as it had thousands of times before. The air smelled of damp cedar and fresh soil after a light rain, and small ripples reflected the orange glow of the setting sun. Nothing about the place felt dangerous or neglected. It felt dependable. That was the word my grandfather had always used. Dependable. I tried one final time to avoid a larger conflict by inviting Linda Harper to meet me at the property. She arrived precisely on schedule carrying a leather portfolio instead of hiking boots. I carefully showed her maintenance records, explained every annual inspection, pointed out the reinforced spillway, and even offered to pay for an independent engineering review with my own money. If the engineers say this dam should come down, I told her, I will accept their decision. Linda barely looked at the documents. The engineers are not the problem, she replied. You are. Then she smiled and added, you could have ended this weeks ago with $400. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. No, I could have made it easier for you to take something that was never yours. For the first time, I realized we were no longer having the same conversation. I was talking about engineering and property rights. Linda was talking about winning. As she drove away, the only sound left behind was the steady flow of water across the crest of the dam. My attorney called the following morning with difficult news. Even with strong documentation, the legal process could take months, possibly longer. There was no guarantee we could stop construction before a judge reviewed the case if the Homeowners Association convinced the right people to move quickly. After the call, I spread 3 generations of photographs across my kitchen table. My grandfather building the dam. My father measuring water levels. Me holding a shovel almost as tall as I was. Then I looked at the latest demand letter resting beside them. $400. It almost seemed ridiculous after everything my family had invested in that place. That was when I stopped thinking about how to win an argument. Instead, I started thinking about what would happen if everyone else insisted on learning the truth the hard way. The morning the contractors arrived felt strangely peaceful. Thin fog drifted across the surface of the water, and the smell of damp earth mixed with fresh cedar as the first rays of sunlight reached the top of the spillway. I had barely finished my coffee when the low rumble of diesel engines echoed through the valley. 2 pickup trucks rolled onto the access road, followed by an excavator on a trailer. Behind them came Linda Harper in her familiar white sport utility vehicle, carrying a folder under one arm, as if she were attending another board meeting instead of overseeing the end of something that had stood for more than half a century. She stepped out, greeted the foreman with a confident smile, and handed him a stack of papers. I walked over calmly and asked whether everyone had reviewed the original engineering records before beginning any work. The foreman looked uncomfortable and admitted that his company had simply been hired to remove what they believed was a privately owned decorative dam. They had received engineering drawings from the Homeowners Association, but nothing from the county. I thanked him for his honesty and handed him a thick binder containing original permits, maintenance inspections, structural drawings, and survey records dating back decades. He flipped through several pages, stopped at an old county approval stamp, then looked back toward the spillway. His expression changed immediately. These drawings are not in the packet we received, he said quietly. I need my supervisor to see this before we go any further. He stepped away to make a phone call, while the excavator remained idling beside the water. Linda stepped between us before the conversation could continue. Everything has already been approved, she said firmly. "We are not delaying this project because someone found an old binder." The foreman remained respectful, but he no longer sounded confident. "Ma'am, I just need confirmation from my office." Linda folded her arms. "You have your work order." The crew exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody reached for a tool. Even the excavator operator kept both hands away from the controls while waiting for instructions from his supervisor. Standing beside the old concrete wall, I felt the cool breeze carrying tiny drops of mist across my face while the steady sound of flowing water filled the silence between each machine. I remembered every weekend my father had spent teaching me how to inspect expansion joints, remove fallen branches from the spillway, and measure seasonal water levels with nothing more than a ruler and a notebook. Those memories felt much louder than the equipment surrounding me. The first bucket of the excavator pressed carefully against a section of reinforced concrete near the edge of the structure. Instead of dramatic destruction, there was only a dull scraping sound followed by small fragments sliding into the shallow water. Then something unexpected happened. The foreman walked to the edge of the spillway and stared at the water for several seconds without saying a word. He compared the current with the elevation marks printed on his construction drawings, then looked back toward the binder I had given him. "Something is not right," he said quietly. "These elevations do not match our plans." He immediately called his supervisor again. This time the conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. Nobody touched the dam. Nobody started another machine. The only sound came from the steady flow of water moving beneath the concrete. Linda grew visibly impatient. "We are wasting time," she said. "This entire argument started over $400. I looked at the river instead of answering. She still believed the fee was the story. She had not realized she was standing in front of a structure built to manage far more than my property. The supervisor instructed the crew to suspend all work until additional engineering records could be reviewed. The equipment was shut down for the rest of the afternoon. Early the following morning, just after sunrise, a county water authority truck turned onto the gravel road, followed by another pickup carrying 2 county engineers. Watching those vehicles approach, I realized the river had finally found someone willing to listen. The county water authority truck rolled to a stop beside the gravel road, followed only minutes later by another pickup carrying 2 engineers with reflective safety vests and thick binders tucked beneath their arms. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. The construction crew shut down every engine, and the quiet that followed felt louder than the machinery had moments earlier. One of the engineers introduced himself, shook my hand, and asked whether I still had the original permit number referenced in the maintenance records. I opened the same weathered binder that had traveled with my family for decades and handed it to him. He slowly turned each page, comparing signatures, survey maps, and inspection notes with digital records on his tablet. The only sounds were birds calling from the trees and water flowing steadily across the spillway. Linda Harper stood several yards away, speaking confidently into her phone, assuring someone that the county engineers were simply being overly cautious and that the project would continue before the end of the day. Her confidence lasted until the senior engineer closed the binder and looked directly at her. "Who authorized modifications to a registered flood control structure without first requesting a watershed review?" he asked. The question hung in the cool morning air. Linda opened her mouth, paused, then finally answered, "We did not know a watershed review was required." The engineer nodded once. "That is exactly the problem." Another engineer walked downstream carrying a measuring rod while a technician used surveying equipment to compare elevations with archived maps. After nearly an hour, they gathered beside the spillway and reviewed their findings together. Finally, the senior engineer looked toward Linda and explained that the original records identified this structure as part of a broader water management system connected to upstream drainage calculations completed decades earlier. Although privately maintained, it had been incorporated into county flood planning long ago. Any alteration required technical review from multiple agencies before construction could legally continue. Linda insisted the Homeowners Association attorney had never mentioned any of that information. The engineer calmly replied that engineering records do not disappear simply because someone fails to request them. A temporary stop work order was issued on the spot, while additional agencies reviewed the file. The construction foreman sighed with visible relief and instructed his crew to secure their equipment instead of continuing demolition. Several workers thanked me quietly as they packed away tools because they had become increasingly uncomfortable once they realized the engineering history was far more complex than the original work order suggested. Throughout the afternoon, the county engineering office coordinated directly with the water authority instead of sending more inspectors to the property. Archived engineering files, watershed records, and historic permit documents began arriving electronically from county offices. Every file confirmed another piece of the same story. Nobody involved in the Homeowners Association project had ever requested any of them before approving. The removal. My grandfather's original drawings matched county copies almost perfectly despite their age. My father's handwritten maintenance logs aligned with official inspection dates recorded years earlier. Everything my family had preserved suddenly mattered. I did not celebrate because there was still nothing to celebrate. The investigation had only begun, and I knew better than to mistake a pause for a victory. I simply stood beside the familiar concrete wall watching professionals do exactly what I had hoped they would do from the beginning. They ignored opinions and followed evidence. As the afternoon faded into evening, a bright stop work notice was attached to temporary fencing beside the idle equipment. The paper fluttered gently in the breeze while the river continued moving with quiet confidence. Linda stared at the notice for several long seconds without saying a word. $400. She had repeated that number for weeks as though it explained everything. Now nobody at the site was talking about the fee anymore. They were talking about permits, watershed records, engineering approvals, and 56 years of documented history. For the first time since this entire dispute began, I no longer felt like I was defending the river alone. The facts had finally arrived, and they were speaking much louder than either of us ever could. Over the next 2 weeks, the quiet stretch of river became the busiest place in the county. Instead of construction crews, the gravel road filled with inspectors, surveyors, environmental specialists, and engineers carrying measuring equipment and old maps. Every morning, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with damp grass, while another government vehicle pulled onto the property. I spent most of my time answering questions and opening storage cabinets that held decades of carefully organized records. One engineer laughed softly as he flipped through my grandfather's original notebooks and said he wished every infrastructure project kept documentation this complete. Another compared those handwritten measurements with modern satellite data and found they matched almost perfectly. Piece by piece, the story my family had, protected for generations, became impossible to ignore. The official review concluded that the structure had never been just a private pond. It slowed seasonal runoff, stabilized downstream flow, reduced erosion, and had quietly become part of the county water management model over many years. Removing it without comprehensive engineering analysis could have created unnecessary environmental and infrastructure risks that nobody involved in the Homeowners Association project had evaluated. The findings spread through county offices far faster than the Homeowners Association expected. Within days, the removal project was formally suspended while the engineering review continued. Emergency board meetings replaced ribbon-cutting plans. Attorneys who had once sounded confident suddenly spoke much more carefully. Linda Harper, who had spent weeks insisting the issue was nothing more than a $400 compliance dispute, now found herself answering questions about engineering records, watershed documentation, and decades of county approvals she had never bothered to review. During one review meeting, Linda insisted the board had acted in good faith and simply relied on the information available at the time. The investigators remained polite, but they focused on documents instead of explanations. They requested the engineering reports supporting the decision to remove the dam. None existed. They requested records showing anyone had reviewed the original county permits. None existed. They asked whether a watershed review had ever been requested before approving demolition. Once again, there was only silence. For weeks, Linda had repeated the same number, $400. Now nobody in the room mentioned the fee anymore. The only numbers anyone cared about were permit numbers, inspection dates, survey records, and engineering files. The project stopped being a disagreement between neighbors and became a lesson in how assumptions can unravel when examined against documented facts. News traveled quickly through Willow Creek Estates. Homeowners who had once believed the dam was little more than an outdated obstacle began visiting the property to ask respectful questions. Several admitted they had never realized the water they enjoyed looking at every evening depended on decades of careful maintenance. Others apologized for believing rumors without verifying them. I accepted every conversation with the same answer. None of this was ever about winning an argument. It was about understanding what already existed before trying to replace it. Even the construction company expressed appreciation that the stop work order arrived before any meaningful work had been completed. Their foreman shook my hand and admitted that reviewing the original engineering records had probably prevented a very expensive mistake for everyone involved. Standing beside the spillway one calm evening, I watched golden light ripple across the water exactly as it had when I was a child. The same current some people had dismissed as an outdated inconvenience had quietly defended itself with nothing more than facts, engineering, and time. I never defeated Linda Harper. I never defeated the Homeowners Association. The evidence did that on its own. $400 had started the argument. The truth finished it. 3 months later, the valley looked almost exactly as it had before the entire dispute began, yet everything had quietly changed. The morning air still carried the clean scent of cedar after sunrise. The water still slipped gently across the spillway with the same familiar sound that had filled my childhood weekends. Red-tailed hawks circled above the trees. Turtles rested on old logs near the shoreline, and the reflection of the sky stretched across the calm surface behind the dam as though nothing had ever interrupted its routine. The difference was that people finally understood what they were looking at. The county completed its review with recommendations that permanently recognized the structure within future watershed planning documents while confirming my continued ownership and maintenance responsibilities. Additional engineering records were digitized so that no one would ever have to search dusty archives to understand the history again. The Homeowners Association quietly withdrew every demand, every compliance notice, and every legal claim related to the property. Their insurance carrier reportedly questioned how the project had advanced without comprehensive engineering review, and future board members adopted new procedures requiring independent verification before taking action involving neighboring landowners. I never attended those meetings because I had no interest in watching anyone apologize. The paperwork spoke for itself. One afternoon, I noticed Linda Harper walking quietly along the public road overlooking the lake. She stopped for a moment, looked across the water, then continued without saying a single word. Weeks earlier, she had been certain the entire dispute was about $400. Now she understood it had never been about the money. I felt no satisfaction watching her leave. Anger would not improve the river, and resentment would never honor the people who had built and protected it long before either of us arrived. My grandfather had always believed that the strongest foundations were not made from concrete alone, but from patience, honesty, and careful work repeated year after year. I finally understood exactly what he meant. Every inspection he completed, every notebook he filled, every permit he carefully stored, every quiet weekend spent clearing branches from the spillway had become part of a story that protected this place long after he was gone. Standing on top of the old concrete wall with a warm coffee in my hands, I realized the greatest victory had nothing to do with attorneys, investigations, or official letters. The real victory was that truth had survived because someone chose to preserve it when nobody else thought it would ever matter again. Looking downstream, I watched families fishing along the banks while children skipped stones across the gentle current, completely unaware of how many quiet decisions had protected that river for generations. That thought made me smile. People often believe strength belongs to whoever shouts the loudest or wins the biggest argument. My grandfather believed something different. Real strength is built one careful decision at a time until responsibility becomes part of the landscape itself. As the sun settled behind the hills, I placed my grandfather's weathered notebook back inside my truck beside the same binder of permits that had followed me through every meeting, every letter, and every argument. Then I looked across the calm water one last time before heading home. Linda Harper believed this story was about $400. It never was. It was about 56 years of engineering, responsibility, and respect for a river that had quietly protected this valley long before any homeowners association existed. They thought they were tearing down a dam. They almost erased 56 years of engineering. In the end, the river remembered who respected it, and so did everyone else.